In the previous lesson, you get to learn the inference question type in the SAT, which essentially asks you to draw a logical conclusion from the passage. You will now be asked to do a reverse step in this inference skill, which is finding evidence to support a stated conclusion. In other words, instead of finding a conclusion, you will find evidence to support this conclusion. There are two types of evidence that you will be asked. One is textual evidence, where the answers can be a specific example or a quote. The other type is quantitative evidence, where the question will give you a graph or a table and the answer will use one specific information from that graph or table. We will look deeper into this type of quantitative evidence in the next lesson, lesson 13. Today's lesson will focus on the command of textual evidence. A command of textual evidence can either ask you support or undermine the conclusion. The first example asks for support. In this case, they even tell you the conclusion directly in the underlined portion. In other cases, you might have to read the entire passage to get the conclusion on your own. Here, the research concludes that when faced with too many choices, consumers are less likely to make a purchase, and if they do make one, they are less likely to be happy with it. So, the answer should be in agreement with this conclusion. Now, let's take a look at the answers we are given. These answers will be either supporting, undermining, or not related to the conclusion at all. Read through every answer and classify them accordingly. Why so? Because you might have more than one supporting example. Shockers, right? That's why the question asks you for the most strongly support answer, so comparison might need to be made later. In a lot of cases like this one, a supporting answer can be a specific example to illustrate the general conclusion. To ensure the example is having the same logic as a conclusion, a good tip is to replace the specific words with the general term and see if the logic still remains the same. For example, answer A gives you a specific feelings when people face large number of options. They feel overwhelmed. This feeling can be a specific example of the umbrella term in the underlined conclusion, feeling less satisfied. Because the logic remains when we replace this overwhelmed feeling with the term feel less satisfied, this must be the supporting example. Give it a plus sign. This could be the answer if there are no other supporting ones. Now let's go through the rest. B can easily be a negative sign or it undermines the conclusion because it directly contradicts the passage. People, when given more choices, would be less likely to buy jam, not more. C and D also go in the wrong directions as well, since they imply that more choices lead to a positive outcome. So both are negative sign or they undermine the conclusion. Since there is only one supporting answer, A is obviously the correct answer. But if the question asks for most strongly undermined answer, you will need to compare B, C, and D. We will do an example like this later. There are also other cases that require finding the conclusion on your own, like this example. So what is a scientist theory? Usually, you don't need to read the entire passage to locate this conclusion. You can skim through and use visual cues like the last sentence or keywords like in this one, where the last sentence starts with "they theorize" to signal the theory researchers come up with. Now we know that the theory or the conclusion is replay during this period helps the brain consolidate new information, moving it from short-term to long-term memory. The reference, this period, tells you that we need to look backwards a bit to find more information, which can be found in the previous sentence, that it refers to this deep, slow wave sleep or in the first 3-4 hours of the night, not during REM sleep or when people dream. So in short, the researchers theorized that replay during deep sleep or early sleep helps the brain retain new information long term. Now let's go through the answer choices to see if each specific scenario supports, disagrees, or is unrelated to this theory. A says that athletes who sleep more perform better. So it is unrelated to the theory because it only involves the amount of sleep, not anything about consolidating new skills. Let's put a neutral wiggle here. B does mention retaining new information in a longer period of time, but is in REM sleep, not in early sleep cycle like the theory. So it's actually contrast, put a negative sign. C is technically like what A says, but in the opposite direction, stating that the amount of sleep doesn't make a difference in performance. You can argue that retaining new information means better exam performance, but the theory also focuses on long-term memory and how sleep can affect this ability, while answer C undermines the effect of sleep. So put a negative sign here. D is the only one that is in agreement with the theory, as sleep for several hours is the replacement for early sleep cycle, or when replay happens like in the theory. And those who do this memorize better after 2 weeks of learning, or this new information retains better in long term. So this example does support the idea that replay early in sleep cycle consolidates learning. Another variation of finding supporting example to a claim can be worded like this: which quotation illustrates the claim? These questions are more likely to accompany fiction or poetry passages. Instead of looking for a specific example to a general conclusion like before, you are asked to look for a quote directly from the excerpt. This might be tricky to English as a second language students, as you need to navigate old-fashioned and possibly metaphorical language in order to understand what the quote is saying. For example, with this one, they already tell us the intention of the poet, which is to urge the listener to remain hopeful even in tough situation. Usually, figurative quotes answers are harder to classify, whether they support, contrast, or unrelated to the intention. Most of the time, you want to look for the positive, negative, or neutral emotion or structure conveyed in the poem and see if it aligns with the message intended by the author. A focuses on dragging footsteps. This is unrelated to encouraging someone to be hopeful, so it discussed hardship but no encouragement. Can be either negative or neutral feelings. Just put a negative or neutral sign here. B, this describes the difficult, winding path the speaker and listener are on together because there's a we here. It acknowledges hardship, but it doesn't urge the listener towards hope. If it's more of a statement of shared struggle related to the theme of difficulty, but no direction to encourage hope, we can put a neutral sign here. C states that heed not the darkness. This means don't pay attention to the bad circumstances around you. It's a direct instruction to ignore despair, and then it says the clouds grow thickest when the summit's nigh, means things often feel worst right before you reach the top or when you succeed. This is an encouragement. Do not give up, you are almost there. This directly matches the claim. The speaker is urging the listener not to lose hope even in difficult circumstances. Let's put a positive support feeling sign here. D is a rhetorical question, implying that no one should stop or complain. It contrasts weakness, but does not really actively give hope. So negative, neutral feelings as well. So you see that C is the only quotation with the positive feelings, like the hopeful message of the author, hence is the correct answer. The undermine or weaken questions are based on the same logic and involve the same process as support questions. They just go in the opposite direction, asking you to identify the statement most contradicts with the given theory or conclusion. Some students might find this way harder than the support question because you can rely on paraphrasing skills to find a support answer. But for the undermine question, not supporting answers can be unrelated, which might confuse you to work around whether it directly contradicts with the conclusion or not. So, a good tip for the undermine question is to come up with the antithesis of the conclusion first and find the example that supports this antithesis. Let's look at this example. The first step is to identify the proposal first. The information appears in the last sentence. Birds survived while non-avian or not flying dinosaurs did not because of the birds' increased metabolic capacity. In other words, metabolic capacity increased, then chances of surviving a mass extinction also increase. Now let's find the antithesis of this conclusion. We want the opposite direction, so it could be metabolic capacity increase, then chances of surviving a mass extinction decrease, or has no effect. Now it's easier to find the answer that supports this contrast relationship that we just wrote down. A is unrelated to this relationship of metabolism and survival. B talks about factors affecting metabolism, also unrelated to the correlation of metabolism and surviving a mass extinction. C compares metabolism of birds to other creatures, also unrelated to the survival. D is the only answer that supports our antithesis, giving a specific example of creatures with high metabolism but still did not survive extinction. So this must be the correct answer. Now let's put everything we've learned into solving these practice questions together. Feel free to pause and try on your own first before looking at our explanation. This first poem example asks you for a quote that supports the idea that Bibb emphasized the contrast between appearance and reality. This is a contrast structure which can be shown in keywords like but, yet, or comparison of ideal versus real. Next, we apply the same strategy of classifying each quote by what feeling it conveys and find the one with the same contrast structure intended by the author. A talks about the deep emotion she has in her art. She leaves her mind, her thoughts, her soul, her brain. Even though it has the contrast keywords like but, it's a daring, positive feeling and not related to the contrast structure of the claim. So we put a positive sign here. B praised the quality of her paintings as the power of genius stems them all, so it's also a positive feeling. C describes her process, so it's a neutral feeling and unrelated to the contrast structure that we are looking for. Only D describes not nature self or not how things truly look in reality, and but ideal glows means but a romanticized and imagined version instead. The structure not and but here is a direct explicit contrast, and it also shows a negative feeling, so put a negative sign here. So D is the only correct one because the internal structure of the quote, like not X but Y, mirrors the claim structure, the difference between paintings and the true appearance. A, B, and C each describe only one side, either her process or her talent, with no opposing idea intention. For this second example, we'll start by defining the claim. Dunbar praised Douglas for his honesty and refusal to be intimidated, can be noted as a positive feeling. The correct answer must be positive and illustrates these qualities. A refers to kindness, which is also positive but not the same as honesty. Let's put a positive sign here first. B is a relatively neutral description of a pause or silence. C mentions no soft-tongued apologies or spoke straightforward. It indicates honesty, and this phrase Fearlessly uncowed means refuse to be intimidated. So both positive qualities from the claim. Let's note two plus signs here. D praises his loyalty and devotion, also positive feelings, but not quite a match with the qualities in the claim. So in some questions, multiple answers point in the same general direction. A, C, and D here are all positive. So this is a more advanced question type where the general feeling alone is not enough to find the answer. When this happens, go one level deeper and ask which quote matches the specific qualities named in the claim, not just a general tone. The correct answer is always the one that is closest and most complete match. Here, C names honesty and refusal to be intimidated explicitly, while A and D name different virtues entirely. This third example will give a better look on the nuances of numerical description. If you scan the passage, you will find the word researchers in the second sentence. The rest of the passage is essentially dedicated to describing what they found. Left digit bias caused journalists to cover unemployment differently than figures cross a round number, even when the actual difference is negligibly small. From this finding, we know that we need an example showing journalist coverage changing specifically because a number crossed a round number threshold, with both sides of the threshold present for comparison. A and B are unrelated to the finding because A is completely off topic and B does not fit because the passage does not even mention consumer spending. C says that a newspaper ran several stories when unemployment reached 5%, but quickly stopped coverage. So it shows a reaction to a round number, but only captures one moment. It doesn't have the contrast between two similar numbers on either side of a threshold. So this partially support, let's put a mild positive sign here first. D says that a newspaper published significantly fewer stories when jobless rate was 3.9% than when it rose to 4.1%. You see that 3.9 and 4.1 are nearly identical in real terms, a difference of only 0.2%. But because 4.1% crosses the round number threshold of 4%, so it shows a dramatic difference in coverage volume despite nearly identical figures. So this answer directly demonstrates left-digit bias in journalism or strongly supports researcher findings. Let's put two positive signs here. So between two supporting answers, C and D, both pointing at the right direction, D is the stronger answer because it shows both sides of the round number threshold with a measurable coverage difference, which is exactly what the researchers described. C only shows one data point, so the contrast that makes the bias visible is missing. Moving on to this undermine example, remember the strategy. We look for the conclusion and its antithesis first. Then we find an answer that most strongly supports this opposite stance. So what did the neurobiologists say? They say that the creatures, or birds specifically, gave up smell in favor of improved eyesight. So the antithesis of this finding will indicate that birds have both good eyesight and a sense of smell. Answer A says that birds' genomes contain proteins that bind to odors and relay signals to the brain. So this is direct biological evidence that birds can process smell at a molecular level. So most strongly support the antithesis that we just stated. Put a double positive sign here first. B partially covers the original claim, saying that birds have far fewer olfactory neurons than most animals, or they have fewer smell processing cells, not necessarily comparing with eyesight. So put a negative or even neutral unrelated sign here to indicate that it's not really supporting the antithesis. C directly suggests Smell is less useful to birds in practice. This partially undermines the antithesis that birds have both good eyesight and a sense of smell, because it does not discuss eyesight, so put a negative sign here. Or in other words, this partially supports the original claim. D suggests vision dominates over smell, which strongly undermines our antithesis or strongly supports the original finding. So put two negative signs here. So the correct answer must be A. It is much easier to know both directions of a claim before classifying answers, especially ones with nuances like this example. What is the researcher's conclusion? That non-caffeinated compounds likely play a role in the positive relationship between coffee consumption and health. The correct answer must therefore be consistent with the idea that something other than caffeine is responsible for coffee's health benefits. A states a factual difference in caffeine levels, so the description of composition with no health effects discussion is unrelated to the finding. B mentioned an enzyme which is not caffeine that provides health benefits. This is actually a specific example of general conclusion because it names a specific non-caffeinated compound in decaf coffee and its specific health benefits. In this case, neuroprotective benefits. So put two positive signs here. C points to caffeine as the active ingredient that benefits in losing weight, which actually contradicts to the researcher's conclusion. Lastly, D says that coffee drinkers are healthier in general, which partially agrees with the conclusion, but it fails to specify non-caffeinated compounds as the cause. One tiny positive sign at best. So, between two supporting answers, B and D, B is much stronger and exactly match the researcher's finding, so it must be the only correct answer. Okay, example 6 here will show you a different kind of answer that can support a conclusion. First, what is the scientist's expectation? If you're not sure where to look for this information, focus on the end of the passage where key information of these type of questions is most likely to be located. Indeed, the word expected appears in the last sentence. Basically, the scientists expected that self-pollinating plants would eventually become more vulnerable to shifts in their environment. A and D are off topic because A describes a cross-pollination process that actually works against the self-pollination scenario, and D describes an efficiency gain in the self-pollination process, not environmental vulnerability. C would weaken rather than support the expectation because plants without genetic defects would be less likely to become vulnerable to disease. This actually undermines the claim. Let's put a negative sign here. Then B is the only support answer because it explains that less genetic variation means less ability to adapt to environmental threats or susceptible to a variety of pathogens. This is not a specific example to a general conclusion like other examples, but it is the mechanism that explains the stated observation or hypothesis. For our last two examples, we will try fiction passages where you are asked to find textual evidence to illustrate a writer's claim. This type of question does not use as much challenging language as the poem question, but the skill to extract literal meanings from rhetorical means is the same. What is the writer's claim? That the beauty of Alma Thomas's work emerged when she moved away from figurative art and began to work abstractly. The correct answer must show a direct contrast between her figurative work and her abstract work, with the abstract work coming out clearly superior. A mentions Thomas's use of color, but does not indicate whether this painting was figurative or abstract, so it's partially supporting the claim at best. B is off topic because it focuses on the subject matter of her work rather than its style. D is unrelated and incorrect for the same reason as B. It only describes her artistic philosophy. Only C offers an explicit contrast between Thomas's figurative work, the 1964 painting, which is described as labored, and her 1970 abstract work, which is glowing and rich. This strongly supports the claim and illustrates the contrast structure intended by the writer. Same concept example, but this last example here is a more advanced one because of the dense and figurative literature. So try to stick with the general direction of feelings like we did with the poem question. What is the claim? That Dorothea believes she and Mr. Casaubon may have many things in common. The correct answer must therefore emphasize Dorothea's belief in their similarity. This is generally a positive feeling. A says that Dorothea, looking deep into his mind, seeing reflected there every quality she herself brought. Or literally, she looks into his mind and sees her own qualities reflected back. This shows Dorothea's positive feelings towards him and also indicates an exact match with the claim that she perceived him as very similar, if not downright identical to her. B only indicates that Dorothea, or here Miss Brooke, is already interested in marrying Mr. Casaubon, so it points to the positive direction, but only describes her willingness to marry, not specifically shared qualities. C only describes Mr. Casaubon's scholarly work, not even mentioning Dorothea, so it's completely off topic. D is a tricky one because it also shows strong positive feeling Dorothea has, describe her admiration and interest in what he says. However, it only conveys the idea that Dorothea is extremely interested in what Mr. Casaubon has to say because of her youth. It does not explicitly mention that she views him as being similar to her, so not an exact match to the claim. So we see that this question has three quite positive supporting answers. But because of the figurative description, it is easy to get confused between B, D, and A. The key is to go beyond the general positive feeling and ask which answer matches the specific claim most completely. B and D both show Dorothea's positive feelings towards Mr. Casaubon, but neither mentions similarity or shared qualities directly. Only A explicitly shows her seeing her own qualities reflected in him, making it the closest and most complete match to the claim. You can find more practice for both fiction and science passages in the quiz below this lecture with detailed explanations for each question. The homework section includes scoring so you can measure how well you're applying what you learned here. If this lesson felt challenging, we recommend starting with the easy questions in the domain practice to build familiarity first, then working your way up to harder difficulty levels.